Ever feel like you're designing in this echo chamber? Like, um, you tweak a button here, adjust a layout there, but you're missing the bigger picture of how it all connects.
Yeah.
That's what we're tackling in today's deep dive. Going beyond those individual design choices to uncover the invisible systems that make or break our work. We've got two fascinating pieces to dig into today,
Mhm.
both about making systems thinking tangible, especially for us visual thinkers.
Right.
First up, an excerpt all about visualizing the systems behind our designs, and then we'll jump into a chapter from the systems thinker, which gives us a broader framework for connecting those aha moments to action.
And I think what's really cool is that both of these sources emphasize that we're not just talking about making pretty diagrams here. This is about finding those leverage points, the places where a small change in design can create huge ripples. It's about impact.
Okay, I love that word, leverage. Both sources talk about it, but they come at it from slightly different angles, right?
Absolutely. The first excerpt uses this really compelling analogy of the overview effect. You know, when astronauts see Earth from space and suddenly grasp how interconnected everything is?
Oh yeah, that shift in perspective must be incredible.
Exactly. And this source argues that we need that same shift when it comes to design. We
Yeah.
get so focused on the pixels and the components that we forget we're actually designing within these complex systems with their own rules and relationships.
It's like we're stuck in the weeds of a design system, which, don't get me wrong, they have their place, but they're only one small part of the whole picture.
Exactly. Design systems are a tool, but they're not the whole toolbox.
Yeah.
This deep dive is about expanding that view, seeing those systems beyond the buttons, and understanding how our design choices reverberate through them.
And that's where these visualization tools come in handy, right? They give us a way to actually see those systems and wrap our heads around the complexity.
Exactly. They make the abstract concrete. One tool that really drove that home for me was the behavior over time graph. They use the example of product debt, which I think anyone who's worked on a large project can relate to.
Oh, tell me about it. Product debt is the bane of my existence sometimes. How does this graph help?
Well, it visually shows how over time the cost of building new features skyrockets as product debt piles up. At the same time, you see the value delivered to users start to plummet because of inconsistencies and that ever-growing mountain of debt.
So you see that divergence happening in real time. And it's not just some gut feeling anymore. The graph makes it clear when investing in a design system becomes essential.
Exactly. And what I appreciate about this source is that they don't just throw these tools at you and say, good luck. They actually walk you through how to use them, like the quadrant matrix. Imagine you've just done a round of usability testing.
Ooh, always a recipe for a mix of exciting insights and, oh no, we need to fix that moments.
Right. So with the quadrant matrix, you plot those usability issues visually based on how frequently they come up and how much impact they have. It instantly helps you prioritize what to tackle first.
That's brilliant. We've all been in those meetings where everyone has a different opinion on what the biggest problem is. This just cuts through all the noise.
And here's the beauty of it. You can adapt it. The example uses repetition and impact, but you can swap those out for other criteria that make sense for your project or your team.
Okay, that's going straight into my toolkit. Now, another tool I'm really intrigued by is the iceberg model. I feel like this one is a classic for a reason, right? It helps uncover those deeper levels beneath a problem's surface.
It's so powerful because it forces you to think beyond the obvious. The source uses a missed deadline as an example. On the surface, you might blame the individual or some immediate cause, but the iceberg model says, hold on, let's dive deeper.
Right. It's like, okay, a missed deadline is just the tip of the iceberg. What are the recurring patterns that contribute to it? Is it poor communication, unrealistic expectations, a lack of clear roles?
Exactly. And then at the very bottom of the iceberg, you've got those mental models, those often unspoken beliefs about how work gets done.
The source gave a great example of that. Always be a first responder mentality that some teams have. They're so busy putting out fires that they never have time to address the root causes of those fires.
And that's where the real potential for change lies. Because if you only address the events or even the patterns, you're just putting a band-aid on a much deeper wound.
Okay, so how do we apply this to design specifically?
It's about using the iceberg model to understand the systemic impacts of our work. Like, what are the potential unintended consequences of a design decision? What are the underlying assumptions we're making about our users or technology?
It's about acknowledging that we're not just designing interfaces, we're designing systems that exist within even larger systems.
Exactly. Ignoring that broader context can lead to some pretty negative outcomes. That's why having these tools to visualize the connections and make more informed decisions is so essential.
And speaking of connections, let's talk about feedback loops. This is another area where visualizing the system can be incredibly eye-opening, isn't it?
Absolutely. The source breaks down two main types: reinforcing and balancing loops. Reinforcing loops are those where an action amplifies itself, creating that snowball effect.
Ooh, like those addictive app notifications. You check one, it triggers a cascade of others, and suddenly you've lost an hour scrolling.
Exactly. That's the engine behind a lot of addictive design. And it's something we need to be acutely aware of as designers because those loops can be used for good or for manipulation.
And that's where ethical design comes in. Understand the power of those loops and using them responsibly.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, we have balancing feedback loops. These are all about maintaining equilibrium.
So like a thermostat, it's constantly adjusting to keep the temperature stable.
Precisely. The source gives a great example with customer support access. If it's too hard to get help, you get frustrated customers and a decline in satisfaction. But if it's too easy, you overwhelm your support team and create longer wait times for everyone. It's about finding that sweet spot.
So we've got these reinforcing loops that can spiral out of control and balancing loops trying to keep things in check. It sounds like things can get pretty complicated pretty quickly.
They absolutely can. And that's why the source reminds us that real-world systems are rarely as neat and tidy as the diagrams we use to represent them.
Right, because there are always external factors, delays, unforeseen hiccups that can throw things off balance.
Exactly. And to really illustrate that point, they dive into this fascinating example of electronic health records, or EHRs.
Oh, that's a great one. The intention behind EHRs is fantastic streamline healthcare, reduce paperwork, improve patient care, but then you get into the actual implementation.
And that's where things get really interesting. The source shows how this seemingly simple goal of implementing EHRs introduced a whole new set of challenges.
Like training staff on this entirely new system, migrating massive amounts of patient data securely, not to mention the time it takes for doctors and nurses to adapt to a new way of working.
And all of those things create delays in the system, which they cleverly represent in the diagram with the double line on the feedback loop. It's such a small detail, but it completely changes how you view the system's flow.
And then you have those external factors they mentioned earlier, like software updates that require additional training or adjustments. You can't always anticipate those.
They also point out the importance of accounting for gaps in the system. Like with EHRs, there's this gap between implementing the technology and actually achieving the desired outcome of improved patient care.
And that gap is where a lot of the critical work needs to happen. You can't just expect a new system to magically fix everything. You have to consider all those human factors, the training, the support, the ongoing adaptation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where systems thinking becomes so valuable. It helps us see those connections, anticipate those potential pitfalls, and ultimately design more resilient and effective solutions.
Okay, I'm already seeing so much value in these tools. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of what these sources have to offer. We've covered behavior, overtime graphs, quadrant matrices, the iceberg model, feedback loops, and even gotten a glimpse into real-world complexities with the EHR example.
And we've got even more tools to add to your arsenal. The Systems Thinker excerpt has some real gems to uncover.
Perfect. I am all about diversifying that systems thinking toolkit. What's up next?
The Systems Thinker introduces us to this tool called force field analysis. It's incredibly helpful for understanding why change can be such a bear sometimes.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Because honestly, who hasn't tried to push through a design change only to hit a wall of resistance? It's like the system itself is pushing back.
That's exactly it. And often that resistance comes from forces we don't even realize are at play.
Okay, so how does force field analysis help us see these invisible forces?
It's all about identifying the factors that are both driving and restraining the change you're trying to make.
I'm picturing a literal force field here. On one side, you've got all the reasons why this change is a good idea, and on the other side, you've got everything fighting to keep things the same.
That's a great way to visualize it. And the key is to not just identify those forces, but to really understand what's fueling them. What are the underlying motivations, fears, or even just ingrained habits that are feeding into that resistance?
Give me an example. I always need a concrete scenario to really wrap my head around this stuff.
Imagine you're trying to simplify a ridiculously complex workflow within your company. You've got this sleek redesign that streamlines everything, makes it more efficient, less room for error.
Sounds like a dream. But I'm guessing there's a but coming.
But even though everyone agrees the current workflow is clunky and frustrating, there might be hidden forces keeping it in place.
Like what? Inertia, Fear of the unknown.
Those are definitely part of it. But it could also be something like there are people whose power or influence is tied to the old way of doing things. Or maybe there are deeply ingrained mental models about this is how we've always done it that are hard to shake.
So it's not just about the design of the workflow itself, it's about the entire ecosystem it exists within.
Exactly. And by mapping out those driving and restraining forces with force field analysis, you can start to see where the leverage points are. Where can you apply some pressure to tip the scales in favor of the change?
So maybe you realize you need to address those unspoken power dynamics or find creative ways to shift those ingrained mental models. It becomes a strategy for change, not just a redesign.
I love how you put that. It's about being strategic and understanding the system you're trying to influence.
Force field analysis
Yeah.
added to the toolkit. Okay, what else does the systems thinker have in store for us?
Well, there's the spidergram, which, despite the name, is a pretty elegant tool.
Oh, I don't mind a little spidery visualization. What does it do?
It helps you map out the ripple effects of a decision. You start with that central decision and then branch out, visually showing all the potential consequences, both intended and unintended.
Like those diagrams of the butterfly effect, right? One small action setting off this chain reaction that can have huge and unpredictable results.
That's a great comparison. The spidergram helps us make those connections visible so we're not blindsided by unintended consequences.
Okay, walk me through a real-world example of this. How would you actually use a spidergram?
Sure. The source gives an example of a hospital admissions unit. The CEO has this vision that no one should ever have to wait in line.
Admirable goal, but I can already imagine the challenges.
Right. So the admission staff, trying to reduce their workload and align with the CEO's vision, propose hiring 2 additional staff members.
Sounds like a win-win on the surface. Shorter wait times and more support for the staff.
Yeah.
Where's the spider in this web?
Well, that seemingly simple decision to hire 2 new people can ripple outward in all sorts of ways. The spidergram helps you uncover those ripples.
Okay, like what? What are some unintended consequences we might see?
Well, for one, those new hires impact the hospital's budget. Where's that money coming from? Do other departments have to make cuts to accommodate those new salaries?
Oh, right. There's always a trade-off. It's never as simple as just adding more people.
And then think about the workload for other departments that interact with admissions. Will the records office or HR suddenly be slammed with a surge in paperwork or onboarding requests?
It's like that saying, you can't just pull on one thread without affecting the whole tapestry. Everything is connected.
Exactly. The spidergram helps us visualize those connections so we can move forward with more awareness, weighing both the positive and negative consequences.
This isn't about saying no to change because we're afraid of unintended consequences, though, right?
Not at all. It's about making more informed decisions. In the hospital example, maybe after using the spidergram, they realized that instead of just hiring more staff, they could streamline the admissions process itself.
Like sending patients paperwork in advance or having an online check-in system. So it's not just about solving the problem in front of you. It's about understanding the system well enough to find the most effective solution.
Exactly. It's about systems thinking. And that brings us to another tool we've actually touched on before, but the systems thinker gives us a fresh perspective on it. The behavior over time graph.
Wait, didn't we already cover that one? Why revisit it?
This time the emphasis is on the long-term view.
Ah, so it's not just about plotting the immediate data points, but looking for those larger trends and patterns over a longer period.
You got it. And that shift in perspective can be huge. They use the example of a university department that raised its admission standards.
Which, on the surface, seems like a good thing. Higher standards, more qualified students. What's the catch?
Well, what they didn't anticipate was the initial dip in enrollment that often happens. But if they had looked at the long-term trends using the behavior over time graph, they would have seen that this dip is usually temporary.
So instead of freaking out and assuming the worst, they could have anticipated that dip and even used it as an opportunity to better communicate the value of their program to prospective students.
Exactly. It's about using data to make informed decisions and not overreacting to short-term fluctuations.
This reminds me of what we talked about earlier with the iceberg model. The difference between addressing symptoms and addressing root causes. Looking at those long-term trends with a tool like the behavior over time graph helps us see those deeper patterns and make smarter interventions.
It highlights the need for patience and a willingness to play the long game. Systems change takes time.
I love that. It's not about quick fixes or instant gratification. It's about understanding the system and making those thoughtful, incremental changes that can lead to lasting impact.
And sometimes those changes might seem small or insignificant at first, but when you zoom out and see the bigger picture, you realize they've had a ripple effect on the entire system.
This has been incredible. We've covered so much ground, from force field analysis and spirograms to the long view of the behavior over time graph. I feel like I've got a whole new set of lenses to view my work through.
And there's still more to unpack. But before we dive into our final thoughts, I think it's important to remember that none of these tools are silver bullets. They're just that, tools.
That's a really good point. It's not about mastering every single tool or becoming a systems thinking guru overnight.
Exactly. It's about taking that first step, experimenting, and seeing what you discover. And most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how we learn and adapt.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of systems thinking and visualization, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with? It's all about taking those first steps right, like not getting overwhelmed. Just pick a tool and experiment.
Exactly. And, for us as designers, we have this incredible opportunity, but also this responsibility because these systems we're designing within, they're powerful. And that power can be used for good or, well, not so good.
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially with all the conversations happening around things like persuasive technology, dark patterns, the attention economy, essentially designing things to
Yep.
be addictive.
Exactly. It all comes down to ethics. Those same principles we've been talking about, feedback loops, leverage points, unintended consequences, they can be used to nudge people's behavior, often without them even realizing it.
It's like that saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Hmm.
So much of the technology we use today is designed to capture and monetize our attention, even if it comes at the expense of our well-being.
And that's why designing with intention and ethical considerations is so crucial. It's about asking ourselves, who benefits from the systems we create? Are those systems aligned with our values, with our vision for a better world?
I love that you brought it back to values because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, right? What kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of impact do we want to have with our work?
Absolutely. And those values need to be present throughout the entire design process, from that initial spark of an idea to the way we gather feedback and iterate on our designs.
And it's not always easy, right? Because as designers, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're often working within larger systems, companies, industries, even governments that have their own agendas, their own incentives.
It's true, and navigating those complexities can be challenging. But that's where the power of systems thinking comes in. It allows us to step back, see those competing forces, identify those leverage points where we can make the biggest impact, and advocate for more ethical, more responsible outcomes.
It's almost like we need to become systems change agents,
Right.
not just systems thinkers.
I love that. And it can start with small acts of resistance. Speaking up in a meeting when you see an unethical design choice being made, pushing back on unrealistic deadlines that compromise your team's well-being, educating clients and stakeholders about the importance of ethical design.
It's about using our voices and our influence to shift the system from within.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it might feel like an uphill battle sometimes, but even those small acts of courage can have a ripple effect. Never underestimate the power of planting those seeds of change.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've gone from the nitty-gritty of these visualization tools to these bigger conversations about ethics, responsibility, and the impact of our work on the world around us.
We've explored how systems thinking isn't just about understanding complexity, it's about using that understanding to create positive change.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
Remember that aha moment you had when you first grasped the concept of systems thinking. That feeling of the world suddenly making more sense. Hold on to that feeling. Let it fuel your curiosity. Let it empower you to make a difference because the world needs more people who can see the bigger picture, who can connect the dots, and who are willing to use that knowledge to design a better future for everyone.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions and start putting those systems thinking skills to work. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.